Good afternoon. Good morning. Um, Mo Horowitz, Chief Commercial Officer at Solargik. Solargik is an Israeli solar tracking technology company. We produce trackers and tracking solutions, the software. We operate in DG, CNI, utility, and for today, obviously, we'll be focusing on agri-PV. And a lot of what we're bringing over to agri-PV comes from what we learned in many other places. So the good thing about going after Frank, Wilma, Vladimir, David McGuire is I can skip this slide because if they haven't convinced you by now about the benefits of agri PV, I'm not going to do that. We all know about the benefits, and I think the question we all face is, so if this is such an amazing thing, why is it not yet scaling, right? Why do we not see agri PV taking off everywhere? And the answer is because there's trade-offs. There's a balance, right? And speaking from the investor or the developer side, how do we look at this balance, right? And I think Wilma did a nice job of this. We have to put together financial equations. We have to be able to weigh what was my initial investment and then what is my cash flow stream over the years. We look at NPV, you can use IRR, you can use many different functions, but at the end of the day, that's what you're looking at. What did I put in and what comes out at the tail end? Right now, a lot of the challenges and a lot of what people have spoken about until now is, well, there's a few downsides with agri PV, right, that make it harder to scale, specifically in terms of the upfront capex, right? We know that these structures, people talked about the price, 60 cents, 70 cents for the installation. Labor is fairly more complicated. And if that wasn't enough, they're harder to maintain and they actually potentially generate less energy if we need to now balance it with the crops, right? So if these are the downsides, and how are we actually going to do it? So the answer is there are a few, and we're seeing this in different installations globally, and a lot of this is going to obviously be policy dependent. But one, right, we're all talking about how do you get higher PPAs, tax incentives, right? The question is that a long-term solution? The same way when solar started, you needed some of those incentives, but the idea was that the market has to be able to pick this up by themselves. Where I think we haven't seen enough focus yet is what are the advantages in terms of the land, right? Both in terms of the ability to unlock land that previously we could not develop on, whether that's regulatorily or even in terms of topography, geography, things like that. And we have seen in some countries where the land cost can actually potentially come down because you're not taking the land out of use. You're potentially even shifting your model from an upfront capex model where I have to buy the land to an opex model where I'm paying a lease. And there's a very big financial advantage to that from a NPV, right? The ability to postpone some of those payments to later on, that makes a big difference, right? So this is what I'm going to speak about now. How do we help solve for some of these challenges in red in terms of making it a little bit easier for agri PV to scale? Right. So in terms of the challenges, again, many of these have been discussed. There's complex structural requirements, non-standard terrains, right? We know there are going to be sloped terrains, hills, odd shapes if these are now agri PV rather than just flat desert lands. Dynamic shading for sharing the sunlight, right? Insulate spoke about this a little bit before in terms of the need to balance between crops and energy and modeling that. Uh, and then this is the first time, right, where we actually have potentially conflicting interests between multiple stakeholders. The farmer wants as simple of a possible way to operate on their land. The investor just wants to make the money, right? Obviously, generalization. And they have potentially conflicting interests of how do we balance that with transparency. And again, a lot of mention already of some of the specifics in terms of regulations, right? And not to dive into any of these, but I think Frank spoke about this before, that if we didn't have regulations in place and you were just optimizing for financial outcomes, you would basically do 100% PV, right? And all of these regulations in these different countries are meant to prevent that steamrolling, right? I can only install a certain level of GCR, so I'm not overpowering the plants. I have to maintain crop yields, or some countries at certain levels, to prove that I'm actually still doing real agriculture. right? Height requirements, both for the agricultural equipment, but not necessarily. Sometimes, even if you're growing potatoes, you'll still need a 2.1 meter height based on regulations. And these are things that we know that we need to address and solve. Should there be a better framework? Potentially. But we also, from a technology perspective, want to be able to enable this transition and not have to wait for the regulations to solve for this. So our approach, and this is where we believe we're driving some innovation, is structures that are lightweight and versatile, and that they can actually adapt both to the crops that we have underneath and can be very easy to design around land contours, slopes, regulations, height adjustable, right? These are things that we want to create in terms of the tools that we're using. Dynamic sunlight sharing in a forecastable and controllable way, right? To both give the bank the visibility into their future cash flows, because otherwise they're not going to actually invest and put money down, right? They need to have that certainty, and a platform that allows the multiple conflicting stakeholders to actually have transparency among themselves what is actually happening in the field, right? Uh, all of the projects that I'll show you now are from some of the early stage or from the early projects we've built, and how we're actually trying to solve some of these challenges around structure, adaptability, and sunlight control, right? So agri or PV, right? If you just heard solar energy, this is probably what you're imagining, right? Flat, square, symmetrical, simple desert land. But like many have already mentioned, these are running out, right? Some countries don't even have it in the first place, but we can no longer just solve for this. The problem, or one of the problems on the technology and industry side, is most of the solutions and the tools were actually built for the old world, right? If we think of trackers and structures, they're big, they're heavy, they're robust, and they were not wrong, right? They were right to build this way, but they were building for a previous world. We know that agrivoltaics needs a different approach, right? If you are using big blocks, they are wonderful for simplicity, right? They do have a lot of advantages, but we know that smaller blocks, smaller tools, smaller building blocks give you a lot more versatility and flexibility. And that's what agrivoltaics needs. Why? Because this is what it looks like, right? And this is a project we recently finished with our partners over here at Doral, over a vineyard, over an existing vineyard, right? So if you're going to build above crops that are already there, you need structures that are easy to install and can adjust to different heights, right? We need to make this feasible from an LCOE and from a CapEx perspective, right? We have to be able to go 3-4 meters into the air, and we have to make it easy for the workers to build in the air, right? These are the challenges that we're facing, and it looks a little bit like that. Again, in terms of the adaptability and the versatility, we need different structures that can go above different crops, right? You see here, I think we have some EDF representatives in the room. This is a pilot together with them above grapes. Same way in Aqua, we built with them above apples, lychees, tomatoes, mangoes, different heights, different row distances, right? So you want a system that can adapt itself to whatever crops we have or whatever the contours of the land might be. And the reason we can do this is we are building, or we're using, what we call shorter trackers. Now, shorter, I don't mean lower to the ground. These can go, as I said, very high. We mean fewer panels being moved by each motor, right? So these are what we call our building blocks. And by using shorter building blocks, first of all, we're actually reducing the CapEx. There was a lot of talk about the CapEx before. Now, when we think of a project, right, and people are quoting between 60 cents, 70 cents, $1, that's the installation cost. What we're increasingly seeing is that the land cost is a much, much greater cost of this overall project, not to mention the development. And if we think about the technology, right, panels are getting cheaper, trackers are getting cheaper, inverters are getting cheaper, those are all going down. The only thing that's going up is the land, right? So when we think about the tools we're developing, these tools have to be better at better utilizing that scarce resource of the land, both for agriculture and for energy development, right? So you see a few examples here. Some of these are Agri-PV, some are standard projects, but you see that by using different lengths of the trackers, right, and you can pretty much see this in all of these projects, they are closer to the fence, right? They're using every single little nook and cranny and every piece of the land in a way that a standard tracker that's 2, 3, 4 strings, that's about 150 panels in length, simply could not do. So the power density, or for example, if there's value or benefit to the crop of being covered, you can cover your field in a much more effective way with these shorter building blocks, right? And it gives you a lot more of these abilities to truly utilize this resource of the field. Just to give you a sense of what this looks like in terms of that value, this is a 6.5 megawatt project that we had in India. We had already shipped all of the materials to the field. And then what happens when you do business with family? Bad things happen. There were 4 brothers. One brother decided at the end, I do not want part of this project, and basically said, you cannot install on this square. Now, this doesn't just take out that piece, right? If you're going to use standard trackers, it actually takes out that piece. And that is 20% of the land. You basically just killed the project. You cannot pencil this project with 20% missing capacity. But because we had a versatile tool, we took those blocks that were already on the field, reconfigured them, and actually built the project. Okay, if you look at this from space, you think somebody either was drunk or not paying attention because there's a massive hole, right? But imagine instead of a angry brother, that's a floodplain, that's a pool, that's any other obstacle that you might have had in the field, and suddenly you can use lands that were not feasible. The other major difference between Agri-PV and potentially any other form of ground mount is the ability to perform grading, cut and fill, or slopes. Clearly, if we're doing Agri-PV, that's not going to happen. You're either going to ruin existing crops, you're going to damage the topsoil. From a regulatory perspective, that's not possible. So we really need a tool or a structure that can actually solve for this. And if we think about the issue of slopes, right, and the ability to build on these slopes, is that a standard tracker needs to move many, many panels with one straight line. That's called the torque tube, the drive shaft, right? And that's a very long line. Most trackers are optimized to have as long a torque tube as possible and move as many pieces. That's because they have a big motor. And in a sense, they're forcing the land to fit to them. Okay, we're doing the other way around. We're forcing the tracker to fit the land. And that opens up a lot of lands that otherwise would not be usable, right? To show you what this looked like on a project in the US, right outside of Las Vegas, a project had an existing trackers on site, and everything else around it was deemed unbuildable because it had a 27% slope. So we did the analysis, we did 3D analysis and said, you know what? This is actually doable, right? And again, I'm coming back to the drunk motif. If you looked at somebody installing a tracker on this slope, you would say they're a little bit crazy. And this is what it actually looks like, right? So you can take land that otherwise would not be installable, and suddenly, if you can build on this land, coming back to the CapEx comment, you're going to save a tremendous amount of cost in terms of the upfront land acquisition, more than enough to actually make up for the additional cost of any of the structural necessities in the building process. Structures and CapEx, third point being, how do we balance between these two potentially conflicting outcomes, right? Historically, this is challenging because trackers were asked to do one thing and one thing only, generate more energy. So first you started tracking the sun. We then realized that's not enough. You need to make sure that you're not creating shade for any of the panels behind you, called smart backtracking or smart backtracking. Then comes diffuse optimization. Let's not point at the sun. Let's potentially get any of the indirect sunlight and again, generate more energy. But when we're talking about Agri-PV, we suddenly have another outcome, right? Agricultural outcomes. And if we want to optimize for them, we need to start collecting the data. right? So we've done this in a few different projects with our friends at SolarEdge and Netafim. You see the different agricultural sensors here, PAR sensors, tensiometers. We want to know around humidity, temperature, what's happening under the panels. And the reason we want to know that is because once we have the data, right, we can plug this into our SCADA control. The same way we're measuring wind, irradiance, temperature, and making smart decisions. If suddenly we have a PAR sensor, the PAR sensor is telling us, wait a second, the crops do not have enough photovoltaic activity during the times that we wanted, we can actually do something about it, right? This isn't just ex post facto knowing it, this is being able to control it. So you see the lychees were cold, we gave the lychees some sun, and then they were able to increase their photosynthetic activity. Problem solved? Not quite yet. What did it cost us to do that, right? Can I or can I not do that from a financial perspective? We know that it's great for the agriculture, but how much am I, as the investor or as the bank, putting money into this? Do I want to do that? So that was actually one of the research projects that we did together with some researchers at Colorado State University, Cornell University, and they recently, about 2 weeks ago, released this article. And when we send it out, you see the links on the bottom. I encourage you to read it. It turns out there's some interesting questions that we need to solve. The same way for energy, we have time of day pricing, right? We as consumers want to consume more in the morning and the afternoon. Turns out the plants are pretty similar, right? There are many crops that actually, it's not a linear progression of photosynthesis. And for many crops, there are actually times during the day when they prefer to get their sunlight. And if we can find that right balance, we're going to have an easier time of balancing between these two conflicting outcomes. And again, knowing that I can prioritize crops, that's one thing. Figuring out how much energy am I going to lose by doing that is difficult. Many in the PV world use something called PV-Syst to simulate energy production. That's what the banks use to make the investments. Those tools do not know how to simulate anything other than perfect tracking, right? They can give you a 25-year vision into the future in terms of a standard tracker, but they don't know how to tell you what happens if in the morning hours you're prioritizing the crops, right? And to do that, you need to be able to do two things. You need to be able to control or to understand what the motion of your panels is going to do in terms of the shading. But more importantly, you have to be able to predict how much energy loss that is, right? And that's exactly what we did here. First, we found that this is in Colorado, although this is true for many other crops, that the photosynthesis is happening between sunrise and 11 in the morning. And you see the dotted green and the straight green are the difference between what happens if you have panels or if you don't have panels above the crops. And then the black lines are cumulative, right? So you can see here that by allowing the crops to have that light early in the morning, you're not drastically changing their photosynthesis activity. So the assumptions that we had here are, we need to give them that sun in the morning. They don't need that much sun in the afternoon. Actually, by giving them shade in the afternoon, it's reducing their stress, right? We used meteorological data from PV-Syst, standard year, 1 megawatt in Colorado. What we did is we said, okay, there's a growing season from May to July, and during the morning hours, sunrise to 11, they're going to be prioritized, anti-tracking, what we were showing before with moving the panels, and during the rest of the time, we're going to allow for regular tracking. So how much was lost by the seasonal tracking? We understood that for maximizing outputs, we need to use a few different variables. First of all, you have the distance between the rows. And then you also have the question of, what is my constraint? What is my limitation? Do I have a maximum size of PV that I'm allowed to install? Let's say this was a community solar project, or there's a limited connection to the grid, or is the land itself the actual limitation, right? And there's different scenarios between this. And we found that if there's no land constraint and you're just simply looking to optimize the PV, the difference between seasonal tracking, right, where you're giving some benefit to the crop, and standard tracking was about a 10%, 10.7% decrease in production. And then if you actually increase the pitch, and this is a little bit counterintuitive, we actually, which should make it a more efficient field, right? From a PV perspective, we found that the decrease is actually greater. But the reason for that is because when you have a more efficient field, any reduction or any constraint on that field is going to be more felt. So you're at 11.5%. And then another scenario we ran, fixed amount of land, same on the 6 meter pitch, it's the same as above. And then because we assumed that the land was the constraint, we were able to increase the amount of PV we're installing, and we only had an 11% loss. So the bottom line is there's a 10 to 11% decrease in the energy production by using this tracking methodology. So is that good or bad? It depends. But the true answer, it's good that we can finally put a number down, put that number into our financial models, go to the bank with it, explain how we got to it, and give the investors and the developers much more confidence in the fact that this project is actually bankable, and we did that planning to understand the production. Last slide. Whoops. And not only are we doing this, again, we're putting together a platform that lets the various different stakeholders see what they need to see, right? For example, we know in Italy that in order to get some of the incentives, you need to be able to show that you're doing advanced agrivoltaics. We envision this type of a platform as the ability for the farmer or the investor to go back to the regulator, show them real-time production, real-time models, and then prove that they're actually taking this seriously. And let's say I'm the farmer, right? And I need to move the panels into a safe mode so I can go and do some type of maintenance. Now, at least the asset owner and the farmer can see on the same platform what was actually happening in the field and can figure out some kind of compensation model for those changes to the predetermined plan, right? And that's the value of having one place where the different stakeholders can monitor, control, and actually keep each other accountable in terms of what's happening in the field. So to sum this up, we're building tools that are easier to deploy, specifically designed for agrivoltaics. We're building it at a cost and a capex that makes it easier to deploy because we're not using a lot of steel. These are more cost effective than standard trackers. And we're doing it with technology and software that allows us, the developers, the farmers, to balance all this together and track it so everybody understands what's actually happening in the field. Thank you very much.